Motorsport TV Live, brought to you by Motorsport Tickets, the dedicated motorsport experiences provider.
Hello and welcome to Motorsport TV Live. I'm Chris McCarthy. Coming up on today's show, we'll be looking back at the F2 and F3 season and looking at how China's Guanyu Zhou will get on as he steps up to F1. We'll have insight from Autosport's Megan White, and we'll take a look at how next year's schedule for both series. That's all coming up right here on Motorsport TV Live. It was a long and often dramatic season of F2 and F3, with the titles being claimed by Oscar Piastri and Dennis Hauger, respectively. New formats were rolled out in both series, with extra reverse grids and sprint races scattered throughout a fragmented and extended calendar. We'll be taking a look ahead to what 2022 could have in store, with driver moves and grids starting to take shape. But before that, I'm pleased to say we are joined by Autosport's news editor Megan White to take a look back at the major incidents of the season just gone. Megan, thank you very much for joining us here on Motorsport TV Live. I'm very excited for this one. I made sure that I was in for F2 and F3. Okay, let's start with the top of F2 then. Oscar Piastri, Prema absolutely dominated. Prema back-to-back champions, drivers and teams champions once again, but not with the driver many expected. Oscar Piastri, 3 years in a row, he's champion. What did you make of it?
I mean, it was absolutely incredible. Oscar's done such a fantastic job. As you said, 3 titles in 3 years. And taking the F3 and F2 titles consecutively as well. The only other 2 drivers to have done that are Charles Leclerc and George Russell. So he's certainly in good company. Yeah, it was an amazing season. You know, he took 6 wins, 11 podiums. He was really the standout star of the season. And as you said, Prema took the team's title as well. You know, Robert Shwartzman, Oscar's teammate, did a fantastic job as well. So, yeah, really brilliant year for the team.
How pivotal do you think that first win was in Bahrain? Because he sounded shocked himself on team radio when he won that race. But do you think that helped accelerate his progress in F2?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he was coming into the year as a reigning champion. He had a lot of pressure on him that I don't think even Oscar expected to win the title at his first time of asking. And I think that in many ways, he's sort of shot himself in the foot, because he's now not got an F1 seat to go to because he's, you know, progressed so far so quickly.
Yeah, I was going to say, I totally agree. I think it wasn't... People were almost angry that he didn't have a seat, but he shouldn't have really been in contention anyway. So I guess he's lined up for a seat in 2023. But let's talk a little bit more about his season first. He seemed to carry a lot of swagger about him, didn't he, when he was getting those 5 poles in a row? He has so much confidence as a driver.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's confidence, but it's not arrogance. He's just got a really sure sense of what he's doing and where he's going. And yeah, some brilliant races. I mean, the last 2 rounds of the season, he did a fantastic job in sealing off that title. You know, from Silverstone onwards, when he then moved into the lead ahead of Guanyu Zhou, Oscar really did dominate the rest of the season. As you mentioned, those 5 consecutive poles, you know, which is, I think, the most anyone's ever got, was an absolutely amazing feat, and it really set him up for the end of the season.
Where do you think was the turning point in him running away with it? Because by the end, he completely did it. It was about 50 points. He was clear by the end. Where do you think the turning point in the season was for him?
I think it was probably Silverstone. He left Silverstone in the lead, and I think that his feature race win in Monza as well was a really big pivotal point in the season. And from there, you know, he absolutely dominated, and he did a fantastic job. And then in Jeddah and in Abu Dhabi, you know, securing the crown, then he's done a fantastic job all season. I think that consistency has been really key as well. You know, across Baku and Monaco, he got 3 podiums out of the possible 6. So he's done an amazing job.
Let's talk a little bit about the calendar and the format that they rolled out this year. When they announced it, people were people were in two minds. It was sort of, if it ain't broke, you know, don't fix it. But I don't know, I was probably one of the only people that actually thought it was okay. We had a lot of different race winners. Okay, the rounds were they were too far apart, but what did you make of it overall? It hasn't really lasted long, has it?
No, I mean, there was immediately quite a lot of reservation, shall we say, about the new calendar and the new format. You know, I spoke to some team bosses who said that having 3 races in a weekend was manageable for F2, but it was really quite tough in F3, where the drivers really did need a bit more of that practice and qualifying time ahead of those 3 races. I think that having the reverse grid was great. It introduced a bit more variety. It, as you said, it introduced more winners. But I think that overall, it just didn't really work. And that's why they're changing back so quickly. The gaps as well have been a really big issue for F2. There were 2 months between Sochi and Jeddah. And unfortunately, they've changed the format for next year, but there is still 2 months between Sochi and the last round at Abu Dhabi, which I don't really understand. But I'm guessing it's you know, they're doing the best with what they've got. So hopefully, by changing back to the format they had before, it might solve a few of those problems we had this year.
Yeah, it has often been the case where they're just so determined to want to be there at Abu Dhabi that it creates this big gap. What was the general response from the drivers? Did you get the feeling that they enjoyed the changes, or were they also on the side of the team bosses that it was just a little bit too much?
The drivers I spoke to seemed happy that they got more time racing, but they also did say that the practice time was helpful. I think that was more an issue in F3 than in F2. Especially for rookies in F3, they've got 1 practice session, then it's qualifying, and then you have 3 races. So they were happy with the race time, but I feel like a lot of them would have appreciated a bit more of that practice time. And as well, the gaps in the calendar. I know that in F2, people were, Clement Novalak, for instance, did make a joke about how he'd spent 2 months watching a lot of Netflix because there's just so long between the final 2 rounds.
And looking at the season as a whole, what were the main highlights for you in terms of races? And, you know, was there any drivers that stuck out to you in particular that maybe came in as surprise packages?
Yeah, I mean, Oscar obviously did a fantastic job. Robert Shwartzman, again with Prema, is always really consistently good. He took second really at the last minute from Guanyu Zhou, who had looked pretty set to finish runner-up. But they both did fantastically. I mean, they, it was a great year for Prema again, as you might expect. But I mean, otherwise, there were a few really, really good stand-up drivers through the fields that you might not have necessarily expected. Yeah, I mean, Dan Ticktum actually did a great job for Carlin. You know, Theo Porcher, apart from that awful start line shunt that he had at the end of the season, did really well, and as did Jury Vips, the Red Bull Junior. Yeah,
and you mentioned there Guanyu Zhou, obviously going to F1 next year with great for him just to get that jump up. How do you think he's going to get on? Obviously jumping up to Alfa Romeo.
Yeah, I think Zhou has proved himself in F2. He's a quick driver. He finished 3rd. He was really consistently good this year. And I think he has faced a lot of unfair criticism for his move up to F1. But it will be interesting to see how he gets on. And I can't see why he would struggle too much. It's difficult to adjust, but he is a quick driver. So.
Piastri obviously backed him as well. Some people criticised it because they thought it should have been him. But great for China as well to get a driver back in there. Let's talk a little bit about F3. It was a brilliant year for Prema in total because Dennis Hauger absolutely walked it in F3.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Dennis did such a brilliant job. He led the whole way. He had incredible pace. And that came after a really difficult 2020 for him. He raced with High Tech last year and he only scored 14 points. He came out of that year really struggling with his confidence and that self-belief. And I think Prema really gave that back to him. He said in interviews that joining the team, getting to know how they work, really boosted him. And I think once he started doing well at the beginning of the season, he really built that momentum and he has been consistently great all year.
I mean, when you jump in with Prema, you know you've always got a shout, but to go from 17th, one podium, to the performance he had, absolutely crazy, wasn't it? You wouldn't have expected, I guess you could have expected him to be in contention, but you never would have expected him to win in that fashion.
Yeah, I mean, he's always been quick. He did a fantastic job in 2019 as well, and he just had an off year, I think, in 2020. And for him to come back and to prove his pace, I think really has earned him an F2 seat for next year, although it's unannounced at the moment.
And let's talk a little bit about Frederik Vesti, the Mercedes junior. I mean, some would have expected him. He came in as the second highest ranked driver. You know, Logan Sargent was with the worst team on the grid, so I guess you could write him off as a contender. But were you surprised that Frederik Vesti wasn't more of a title challenger?
Yeah, I really was. I would have probably put money on it. But, you know, Frederik, unfortunately, I mean, he didn't have a bad season. It's important to remember he finished fourth. He won a race at the Red Bull Ring. He got 5 podiums. He was only 9 points behind Clement Novalak in third. But considering the expectations, maybe he slightly underperformed compared to what people might have expected. I'm not saying he underperformed generally. Fourth is fantastic, but maybe you would have expected him to be fighting in among the top 2 or 3 a bit more.
No, I think it's definitely a fair point. Any other drivers that were coming in from championships, maybe from F4, that stood out to you, or just any in the top 10 in particular that did better than you might have thought?
Yeah, Victor Martins did fantastically in his rookie season. He's an Alpine Academy member. He was actually dropped in 2019, and then he won the Renault Euro Cup last year and rejoined the academy for this year, which again gave him that much needed confidence boost. And he did a great job. He 1 win, 6 podiums. I think he could have finished higher if he hadn't had that mid-season struggle that he experienced. But I think he's definitely one to watch for next year. Whether that's in F3 again or if he moves up to F2, I think he's a really strong prospect for the future.
Let's talk a little bit about next year. We'll start with F2. Obviously, we've had testing. Van Amersfoort coming into both championships, which is great, as ADAC and Italian F4 champions. But looking at the guys that were out testing with F2, you know, Prema had Hauger, De Ruvela, UNI Vitrosi, Doohan and Sato, and then Carlin, Lawson and Sargent. What are you making so far of what we're seeing going into next season for F2?
Yeah, I think Doohan's going to be great. You know, he finished second in F3 this year. He was really competitive. He topped the final day of F2 testing for Virtuosi, who he joins next year. So I would really keep an eye on Jack Doohan next year for sure. You know, as we know, his dad, obviously, Mick Doohan, 5-time MotoGP world champion. It runs in the family to be quick. So I think Jack's definitely one to watch for next year. Logan Sargent's finally getting his chance at F2, much deserved, after his year at Charouz, as you said, you know, really helping that team to improve. And Clement Novalak as well is signed for MP Motorsport next year, and I think he'll be one to watch as well. He did quite well in the last 2 rounds of this season and at testing. So, and as you mentioned, Van Amersfoort, you know, joining the grid. Historically a really successful team. Charles Leclerc drove for them in European F3 a few years back. So it'll be really interesting to see how they do across both series.
Yeah, plenty coming up from F3. Let's talk about F3 itself. As ever, we don't usually know who's racing where until really close to the season, but we do know Gregor Saucy is going to be going to ART, having just won the Formula Regional European Championship by Alpine. He's got to be one of the favourites. I mean, he was one of the quickest in testing throughout the 3 days. What do you make of his chances?
Yeah, absolutely. I can see him getting it on the grid and being seriously quick off the mark. You know, he topped testing. He's joining a top team. He's a reigning champion, which gives him that confidence boost. So I think he's definitely one to keep an eye on for next year. And then there's people like Franco Colapinto. He had a really busy season. He did Formula Regional, you know, Asian and European Le Mans. So he might be up there. And Zane Maloney as well, who came third in Formula Regional. You know, the Barbadian driver also won the 2019 British F4 Championship. So those 2 aren't yet confirmed for next year, but I'd be surprised if they weren't on the grid.
If Oliver Beerman gets there as well, I think he could definitely be one to watch. Let's end on a nice story that we had from this year. Juan Manuel Correa back on the grid after that horrific incident at Spa. first of all, what did you make of his performance throughout the year? And are we going to see him on the grid next year? If so, where do you think he might be?
Yeah, I mean, he did an absolutely astonishing job coming back after that accident. I spoke to him before the start of the season, and his journey over those 18 months has been astonishing. He met Sebastian Philippe from ART in Paris last year. He was still in a wheelchair. And he presented this really strong case to actually say, give me a chance. And he's just, he hasn't done that well. He hasn't scored podiums, but he wasn't aiming for that. He was just aiming to be scoring points, and he has done. And I think regardless of where he had finished, he has done such an amazing job, and I think he really deserves credit for coming back so quickly. He's actually done some F2 testing. So we might see him in F2, we might see him in F3, but I really hope that we do see him on the grid somewhere.
Likewise. Megan, thank you very much for your time. Really looking forward to next season. And yeah, hopefully we get to do this again at some point next season. But yeah, for now, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks.
Well, that's all we've got time for. Thanks to Megan for joining me today. I'm Chris McCarthy. Join us again here on Motorsport TV Live for more season reviews and roundups. Bye for now.